all your stuff. What can figure it out? That's how it chooses you.
Hello, Teresa.
Hey, Claire. It's so nice to see you.
So nice to see you. A good morning to you.
A good morning. I was very excited to remember to tell you. So let's just parse that for a second. The me remembering to tell you something is a cause for excitement. Wasn't just excited about a thing. I was excited to remember to tell you. It's springtime. My sap is rising. I am let's go out into the world and do things, and very excited and forward facing, etc. I've been putting vibes out there because I would very much like to date again, and I'm about 2 weeks from my first vaccination, and so it seems like it might be possible to socialize very soon. And so I've been trying to put vibes out, thinking about what I want and the kind of person I'd like to meet, and getting really clear about what I'm in it for, which for some people may be completely natural, but for me, being in relationship is always weirdly fraught. I feel like it's just something I should learn how to do. And so I'm kind of okay, I'll just figure out how to be in relationship with you just for practice, instead of thinking about what I'm actually looking for in terms of somebody I'm spending a huge amount of time with.
Yeah.
And so I thought I might try and adjust that and actually think about what I want, which has been great. And it's working, but it's slightly off. And so my evidence that it's working is that I have been stopped by no fewer than 2 middle-aged men. I'm sending out middle-aged lady vibes, and the middle-aged men are coming.
They are heeding your call.
My middle-aged vibes are bringing the dads to the yard. And they're I'm lactose intolerant. Damn right. I'm lactose. Anyway, I was outside my house walking a dog, and this guy walks by and wants to meet the dog. And I'm yeah, correct. And I was oh, and he's relatively attractive, and oh, he's, open and friendly. And then he just kept talking. I was oh, and now he's just lonely. Oh, okay. So instead of being this thing where he meets my dog and we exchange pleasantries and we live in the same neighborhood and isn't it nice to meet you, it was very clear that he has been alone for too long and quarantine has been very hard for him, and he really just wants to talk to somebody. At the point at which he told me his mother's name on the street outside my house, I was oh, this poor guy. In that moment, I was oh, right. So I asked for this. I just wasn't specific enough.
And also your timing might just be off in the sense that probably a lot of single people you meet right now are going to be like this for a few months.
Yeah, maybe I'm like this too.
I'm just saying, give it a few months and everybody will get their chill back on.
So this guy is talking my ear off, and as he's telling me his entire life story, he starts telling the story of when he moved into his current apartment, which is just 2 blocks from here. And he starts talking about this guy who cut a tree down in the backyard. And he was and I was first of all, I'm literally just trying to let my dog poop. And it was a half an hour, Claire. It was a very long, I was held hostage by this conversation, which begs the question, why didn't I just leave? But okay. He's oh, and this guy who cut this tree down, he was just up in the tree and he had no harness and he was leaning out and lopping branches off with one hand with a chainsaw. And I just got really nervous because I've been in construction forever. And I start piecing it together that he lives in a house that is owned by 2 friends of ours, and that the crazy person with no harness and a chainsaw up a tree was Jeffrey.
For anyone who doesn't know, Jeffrey's dear friend of ours and friend and cheerleader of the podcast. Please go back and listen to the ultra running episode with him that we recorded in 2020, and also the Barkley Marathons episode that he was the inspiration for. And you will understand who he is, how delightful he is, and why we love him so.
Jeffrey had worked on this house because Jeffrey's a handyman. In that moment, I realized, oh, the reason I've struggled through this conversation and the reason I didn't leave is because I needed to know that someone had seen Jeffrey up that tree, because I remember him telling me about doing it, and he's I don't really have a climbing harness, but I think I can figure it out. And this guy was just completely scared and horrified. This is the power of Jeffrey, is he's I don't have all the gear for that, but I can make it happen. And that's Jeffrey's tagline in the world. Long story short, my middle-aged vibes are out there, but I need to calibrate them.
Or just wait for people to get their chill back.
Or that.
I love that other people who don't really know Jeffrey are telling you stories about Jeffrey. That's when you know a friend is an epic presence in the world.
Mm-hmm. I mean, he's a force. He did actually run to work one day when he thought he had a punctured lung. Not only, like, going to work with a punctured lung, but actually running to work. And that's the mythology of Jeffrey. He's like, I didn't do that. I had a broken rib. And I was like, oh yeah, broken rib, punctured lung, whatever. Still, you ran to work with that going on, is the point, Jeffrey. I love him very much.
Everybody, this is the podcast It Chooses You. I'm Claire Patton.
And I'm Teresa Sparks. And the two of us talk about things we like.
Together, because we like each other.
That's right.
And we like you.
Yeah. I just realized I said, yeah, like really questioning, we like you. We do actually like you. But it's honestly, I mean, if you listen, you're clear. It's mostly about us. So as long as you're cool with that ego, you're cool being here. And we're so happy to have you.
Don't forget to like, subscribe. Most importantly, download episodes to support the podcast if you enjoy this episode.
We are available everywhere podcasts are sold. Well, today, you and I are going to talk about a book that we both liked. And I believe we both liked it as children and have sort of revisited it lately.
What's the book, Teresa?
Why, it's It by the Stephen King.
Yay!
Yay!
And, oh, holy fuck, I'm so scared already.
Everyone, this episode contains heavy spoilers for both a 40-year-old book and a 4-year-old miniseries. So if you have not read the book or seen the miniseries, maybe this isn't for you. It'll be a much richer experience for you if you have some experience of the story before. I want to tell you with a lot of pride that a major part of my process with this was reading it late at night in bed and scaring myself. Because I felt like that was necessary for the art, Claire. It's not going to be the same if I read it in the daylight. It has to be 1:30 in the morning, and I have to be so tired that the next day I can't quite remember if I've read a section or not, because bookmarks are for morons. I say bookmarks are for morons. Please know I'm kidding, because I'm the one who has to flip through literally sometimes 60 pages, being like, nope, read that. Oh, here it is. Bookmark would have been so much faster.
What's your Can't believe I'm going to say this phrase. Mm-hmm. What's your resistance to bookmarks, Teresa?
I don't like what they do to the spine of my books, okay? I don't like it. I don't like the little bulge. I don't put anything in my books.
Do you think a sheet of paper?
Sheet of paper is fine. But then I'm going to have a piece of paper sticking out of the book on 3 sides? What fucking, are you fucking crazy?
It's your reverence for the object. You were willing to sacrifice your own convenience in the name of reverence for the object. Mm-hmm. I think that says a lot about you. Mm. I think it's fascinating. We've
scraped off a tiny layer of grime and discovered that I fetishize books underneath it. Yep, that's correct. So I have scared myself a few times in the service of this conversation we're about to have. And I need credit for it, which is why I'm telling you. I never tell you anything except when I need credit for it.
I just want to say I have not recently reread the book. I read it when I was a child. I saw the miniseries with Tim Curry.
Yeah, the 1991.
Yep. It really, really, really terrified me. And I'm sure we'll dig into why. But I'm very proud of you for reading and getting scared by a book in the name of art.
That's all I needed. Thanks. I feel seen. So I read it, of course, this time with adult eyes. I read it many times as a child. And of course, reading it as an adult, it's just a completely different book. Everything I notice about it is different. And scenes that were engrossing and fascinating when I was young are now like, okay, I can probably flip a little quicker through these pages, you know? And I think that's actually, reading it as a child and reading it as an adult is kind of perfect in a way. Because it is so much about adults remembering childhood, children who want to be older, and like the various social and cultural bridges we use to get from childhood to adulthood. But the actual thing that's happening is that you are watching children grow up, and you're watching how their thought develops, and so quickly over the course of a single year, how they become completely different people. That's most of the magic of it for me. It's also about a scary clown who lives in the sewer. Like, that's also happening, sure. And so, like, reading it through that lens has just been really interesting. So I'm really glad that you haven't reread it, actually, because you'll be able to tap into the fear. Because when I was younger and it scared me to death. I couldn't have it in my room. I could not have the book in my room as a child. You can't have a scary clown just like hanging out on your bedside table. What? There's monsters in that book. I'm not keeping this in the bedroom. Like, you gotta be kidding me.
Makes a lot of sense, actually. Let my parents deal with it.
That's right. They can watch TV and they won't even notice it. Because, as we know from it, adults don't notice horrible things that happen to children sometimes.
As you talk, I am just remembering how much of it isn't scary.
Right? Yeah.
Right? We tend to remember the scary moments, but as you're mentioning some of the specific plot points, I'm like, oh, there's a lot of just life in there. What was so frightening about it for me was that the adults didn't know about it and that it lived underground. Mm-hmm. As a kid, basements were already creepy. Storm drains were already creepy. And there's a lot of places that, here in Colorado, I don't really see storm drains very often, but we had them everywhere in Texas. And as a child, I was well acquainted with them. I spent a lot of time playing around there. So then when you read this book, you know, I was past my storm drain phase, but you read this book and it's like, oh, there's actually an evil lurking down there. It's like, oh my God, I could have died.
We are definitely, I'm just going to put a pin very gently in the fact that you had a storm drain period. Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk about that in a future episode.
Something that was really brilliant, and you can tell me if it actually unfolded this way in the book, the fact that it happens to Georgie first, who's even younger than the kids who are main characters, is particularly frightening. Mm. Because anything that would do something so horrible to a little boy, a sweet little boy like that, is horrifying.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, we can talk about metaphors for child abductors, child murderers, pedophiles, things like that, for sure. But once you hit a certain age, like the age that the kids are in the book, you've lost a little bit of your innocence and you've maybe done some bad things. But when you're an adult, you look at someone like Georgie and you think just how innocent and beautiful and bright he is. And the fact that he's the kind of first victim that hits home really is frightening. Like, nobody's safe. As a reader, you're like, oh shit, no one's safe.
Yeah, and to go directly from a very sweet and loving scene as Bill is like coating the toy sailboat or the paper sailboat in paraffin to his arm being ripped off by a clown in the storm drain. And it also, like, really quickly tells you the stakes of this book. Like, that things are real and children will die. I saw a couple things online, people talking about Georgie's death scene in the newest movie and about how they actually couldn't watch it. Like, I think they couldn't watch it and didn't keep watching. It's like watching somebody abuse an animal. Like, watching a child be killed is not, you know, let's not do that. We don't have to do that. The fact that the book basically starts there is super intense. Yeah. Why did it scare you so much? Is there anything about what scared you? I mean, clowns in the sewer. Well, and we've talked before about how, like, when things that are hidden become visible, that's frightening. Because, like, oh, it was hidden before, which means I didn't know it existed, and suddenly now it's here, and that's a surprise, and surprises can be scary.
Pennywise is why it was scary to me. A lot of it was Tim Curry's performance in the miniseries. Pennywise was so scary to me because he engaged in somewhat of a pretense to be nice, friendly, jolly. The veil of that was very thin, admittedly, because he was luring children and reaching out to them. It's not the kind of monster where, yeah, you stumble upon its lair. It's protecting itself. It's the kind of monster that comes and finds you. That goes to where you live and where you play and lures you somewhere you shouldn't be. And uses that jolliness and that clown persona to do that. Kids have a really good bullshit detector. And growing up in Texas, my bullshit detector was going off all the time about quote unquote nice people. So there's something so true in that essence of Pennywise that it's scary. Much like a joke is funnier when it's true, a story is scarier when it's true.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Being the age of the kids in the book, which is like 11 or 12, it's like, all right, we know we're a little more street savvy. But then you did that to Georgie, who's not, who doesn't realize you're creepy. That's where that feels so emotionally difficult. And then also that Pennywise then used the things that they were most afraid of to manipulate them and control them. Within that, especially that he used Georgie. So then he took this innocent, bright soul and distorted it into something frightening to be used to control Bill.
You're talking about when he appeared as Georgie later in the book.
Yeah, I found the use of Georgie, again, especially in the miniseries, that visual of seeing Georgie sort of waterlogged and creepy, and then I believe even eventually speaking in the voice of Pennywise was really frightening because you, beyond being scary, it's ruining the memory of someone.
So it's scary, but it's also mean.
Yeah. Yeah, Pennywise is mean. That's a good point. That's another layer.
It's not just an animal feeding. It's an animal deliberately terrifying and then feeding. Psychically, I know you. I know you so well. I know what your greatest fear is. So I'm going to be that.
Yep.
I'll tell you the things that scared me the most staying up at night to read it as a child are not the things that scared me this time. As a child, I was terrified of their individual encounters with it, right? Richie sees Paul Bunyan statue and somebody else sees a werewolf or whatever. And those were terrifying.
It takes the form of Beverly's father as well, right?
Her first encounter was when all the blood spewed out of her bathroom and got all over the walls, and she realized her parents couldn't see it. But then later, yeah, it takes over her father, essentially. Those were the individual scenes when they're children and they're encountering it alone, when they don't have each other and they encounter it. Those were the things that scared me as a child.
I feel exactly the same.
Because when they're together, it's like, well, someone will have an idea now. Like, we have support. Someone's going to come up with something, right? And as an adult, the things that scared me are sort of, instead of being held in the book, the things that scare me are the ways that the book relates to society. Yes, it's great that the bullies were chasing Mike into the quarry and all of the losers happened to be there and they started throwing rocks at his tormentors. Great. And then Mike is now friends with these people, one of whom does, quote, comedy voices that are all just super fucking racist. Like, all of Richie's voices are just super racist. And now he's friends with and loves and is loved back by someone who also thinks it's somehow okay to talk to him in a pickaninny voice. And, like, no comment made. Mike chuckles because it's funny, you know? And I'm like, oh, that's, oh, wow. So the things that scare me now are like, oh, I really loved this book. What has this book built into me? Like, talking about not being aware of my own bias, this thing that I love has really problematic examples of how we deal with these power dynamics. And of course, like, asking a book from the 80s to approach things the way we want to be and should be approaching things now is, I don't think, fair. And it's not like racism didn't exist in the early 80s.
I'm curious if you think a book like that could be written now. So, of course, coming back to the theme I'm obsessed with, Unsupervised Children. Was the book written in the 70s, the 80s, something like that?
He wrote it from 1981 to 1985. It was published in 1986.
Very much in the heyday of, where are my kids again?
Yeah, exactly.
It just seems like the kind of thing that would be hard to write now, because I feel like people would read it and be like, well, that's unrealistic. What are these kids doing unsupervised?
Right. Right. The same way I watch videos of people talking to each other face to face with no masks on, and I get nervous now. Right. Oh my God, their faces are so close together. Yeah, that was normal until about a year ago, Teresa. That was, yeah.
I would go so far as to say, since our generation was raised on the book the book may itself be responsible for why people actually monitor their kids better now. So we all read this horror story as kids and we're like, well, that is not going to happen on my watch, friends.
That's right. I'm not going to let my kids wander around to be murdered by alien forces in the darkness underground. The feral childhood thing is a huge part of it. And more specifically, I don't know quite how to say this, but he says it in the book, actually. So the asthmatic character, Eddie, which is asthmatic character is not who Eddie Kasprek, he's amazing. I think it's Eddie who sees or understands, like he's the one who has the thought, essentially, that so much of this bullying that Henry Bowers and his crew does of these littler kids, the losers, happens below the adult line of sight. When they have turned their backs, when they're going about their adult business, he says, like they're thinking about mortgages or the car they're going to buy or whatever the fuck adults think, right? Because he's like, I don't know what they think about, but when they're thinking about it, I'm getting my ass kicked by this group of older boys who's torturing the younger kids, right? And he says he knew that Henry Bowers had gone crazy when Henry started doing it in the adult's line of sight, essentially, like pushing it, like, and he's like, oh, now I'm really scared because not only is this guy bullying me and tormenting me, and Henry Bowers and his crew actually break Eddie's arm toward the end of the book. So this is bullying sort of beyond what we think of bullying now in some ways. It's amazing that it could get scarier. And for him, it gets scarier. The bullying he's experiencing gets scarier when he realizes that the person bullying him is not afraid of adults. It's like, oh no, I have no protection. Zero protection in this circumstance. That feral childhood piece is, of course, and if I'm honest, like 1958 in Derry, Maine, and 1984 in Parkersburg, West Virginia are super comparable. And so it was as though I was reading about my own childhood, but it was just written about a different place in a different time. But I was like, no, this is all incredibly familiar to me. Like every single step of this is familiar to me.
I mean, childhood can be very joyful, but there's a darkness to childhood that's real and visceral.
I did a lot of thinking about that, and here is my thought. I'm really glad you said that. My thought is the darkness that's in childhood or can be in childhood is so closely related to the fact that children have so little power to determine the circumstances of their own lives. They are at the mercy of almost everyone. And he touches on that explicitly in the book. At one point, the druggist tells Eddie that his asthma medication is actually water and flavoring. You're not actually sick. Your sickness is in your mind and your mother's crazy. And Eddie is 11 years old or 12 years old, and he's not ready to hear that. He's not ready to deal with it. And he notices that the drugstore guy is like getting some kind of like mean pleasure out of telling him all of this. And he's like, adults, sometimes they just use their power in horrible ways, I think is what he is in the book.
And then those same adults protect themselves from responsibility by saying, oh, well, it's not a big deal. Adults intentionally forget how impactful those moments are when you're a kid.
Yeah.
What a strong effect that has on you when you're a kid. They play it off. Mm-hmm. They forget it. They do that to protect themselves from any kind of responsibility for having harmed you.
There's a lot of casual cruelty of adults toward kids.
Will you remind me, can you just tell me how Pennywise is defeated, both when they're children and when they're adults?
The first time they go into the sewer to find and defeat the thing that is murdering children in their town, they are 11 or 12 years old, and they don't actually defeat it. They injure it, but they are tired and scared, and they don't follow it to make sure it's dead.
How do they injure it?
It has to do with like a mystical ritual that they perform. But they're kids, and so they're like, we read it in a book at the library. This is actually one of the things, it's one of the things I like best, is like, they're trying to figure out how to defeat the immortal evil that lives beneath their town. They're like, we gotta go to the library, you guys. Like, it's just,
right.
I just completely relate to that. We gotta figure this out. They do this ritual, basically, like, the monster, like, takes them in psychically somehow, and, like, they have this psychic battle, essentially. And the first time they do it, Bill is the one who battles the creature. And he does it very successfully and injures it very significantly. The second time, as adults, Bill tries to be the one to fight it, but he, like, misses. He does something wrong and starts to fail. And so Richie, the one who does all the voices, is the one who hops in and he completes the ritual. So they injure it again by successfully doing that thing. And then Bill actually chases it down and, like, destroys its heart, essentially. When you start talking about the monsters in horror books, it gets a little weird talking about how they're defeated, because this thing is apparently, it lives outside of the universe, but it also takes on physical form here on Earth. And, like, they have to kill the physical form, but really they're killing the thing that lives elsewhere.
I'm fascinated with something about this, which is that they decide how to defeat it. They don't really find out. It's not like there's somebody who's like, oh, okay, you're fighting Pennywise. Okay, here's how you do it, right? There's no answer. There's no right answer. The answer is, because we're kids, our particular brand of magic is imagination. And we decide how this works because this is feeding on our fears. So we can defeat it with our power. We decide how to defeat it because, you watch shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and it's all about research. Like some old white dude somewhere has written down the answer. You just have to wade through all this shit to find the answer and then do what the old white dude says. This isn't like that. This is the children controlling their own destinies.
Yes. And not to shit on that idea.
Okay. I mean, I haven't read it, so go for it.
There is a lot of that. A lot of what you just said is true. It's not like they go and they find a list of all the things you can do to defeat them. Like, hey, look, you guys, I found it in the attic of the whatever. It's not like that. But in the moment where they're trying to figure out how they could possibly fight it, once they figured out that it's the one killing the kids, and they're trying, like, how can we possibly defeat this thing? They talk about being at the library, and Ben comes to the Barrens, he comes to the clubhouse, and he's like, look, we have this book, and I read about this ritual that was performed in Tibet, and here's how it goes, and whatever. And they get a little spooked, and they're like, yeah, and I bet when you walked by that book, it basically jumped into your hand, right? And he's like, yeah. Yeah. And so there actually is something that's like helping and supporting them. I mean, it's really just, it's like a question of God and anti-God, right? And if you have this evil thing that feeds on a town by murdering children, if you don't talk about the other side of that, it's just way too dark. There has to be like a positive force also, motoring for the benefit of all beings, right? And a lot of what you said is correct because they are children and he is just embodying their fears. That's how he plays. And they do decide how they're going to defeat him. Oh, they're like, well, silver bullets kill monsters, so we'll make some silver slugs. Like, great, done. And then that works.
I just remember that striking me like, oh, they just decided that.
Yeah, just decided it and then figured out how to do it, which is like, of course, that's my favorite part is like, why don't we get to see them actually making the thing? And it's like, because it's not narratively interesting, Teresa. That's not the point. It's not a YouTube channel, Childcrafts or whatever. You don't need to see how 12-year-olds melt silver in an old mortar shell and make, ball bearings out of them.
It's the mythology of childhood on some level they draw on.
Just believe that this is going to work, and there it does. And this idea that belief works for children is also, it's echoed in a lot of different genres. Like Neil Gaiman talks about it in Good Omens. He talks about Adam, like most people believe things on a scale of like 0.5 to 0.75 Everests, but Adam believes things like 12 to 15,000 Everests worth,
Yeah.
And like the power of that belief to change circumstances and like work magic, really. You asked about how they defeat it. And I think now is the time to talk about this book from a feminist perspective. Because near the end of the book, we discover that it is actually female. So it is not only female, but is very, very pregnant. And the final battle coincides with this creature giving birth. So whether it gives birth because of its injuries or because it's just time for it to give birth, one of the characters, Ben, actually has to follow behind Richie and Bill as they go and fight it for the final time. Ben has to follow behind and kill like 100 little its by stomping on the eggs and then killing the creatures. And somehow to me, the flip that this thing is female, somehow that's the center of the book. It's the center of my experience of this book. Because I have a young, white, heterosexual girl to identify with. Beverly. She is smart and tough and brave. She takes no shit. Awesome so far. Definitely want to identify with her. And then as the book, like the last few chapters of the book, her role and my ability to identify with her both change. And toward the end of the book, it actually seems like she's only there to represent something to these dudes. She's not there for herself anymore. And most disappointing is that the start of that transition of her being a badass actually starts with those silver slugs, because she's the one she's a natural shot. They have a contest to see who's going to be the one to try and kill it with the slingshot and the slug. And they line up 10 cans, and the boys hit 1, 2, or 3 of them, and she hits all 10 dead center. And they describe it like she's not even aiming. She's just supernatural at it. Just bam, 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 and takes them down. So we're like, okay, you're going to be the one who wields the weapon. And she keeps trying to hand it back. She keeps trying to say, no, I don't want to. No, can't someone else handle it? And so she was powerful. They have acknowledged her power and her skill. They assign her the task of doing the thing that she can do, which is fire this slingshot at a monster. And she starts saying no. She starts trying to get out of it somehow. That movement, combined with the fact that it turns out to be female, and also the scene that everyone talks about where they all have sex in the sewer, those things combined, I'm like, oh, damn it, once again, this thing I love doesn't think very highly of me. Or it thinks highly of me only in terms of what I can provide for the people around me, right? I can provide protection. I can provide sex that helps you clear your mind. And so I have incredibly mixed feelings about Beverly and about the role of women in this story. She has heteronormative sex with all 6 of her male friends. The sex scene is not written like an adult sex scene. They're terrified and confused, and she's terrified and confused, but she's terrified and confused and maternal and knowing somehow in a way that I'm deeply uncomfortable with. You might ask why I'm not as uncomfortable with the idea of 11 and 12-year-olds having sex as I am with the fact that the woman is somehow supposed to be the vessel for how they clear their minds.
That is very bizarre.
Isn't it, though?
I have no recollection of this, probably because when I read it as a kid, I couldn't process that.
Yeah, that scene is like, oh, right, that's crazy. All those kids have sex. I remember that. So Stephen King put out a statement on one of the forums on his website in 2013 about that scene, because everyone's like, this is a great book. And then there are 10 pages that make me question everything. And he said, quote, I wasn't really thinking of the sexual aspect of it. The book dealt with childhood and adulthood, 1958, and grown-ups. And the grown-ups don't remember their childhood. None of us remember what we did as children. We think we do, but we don't remember it as it really happened. Intuitively, the losers knew they had to be together again. The sexual act connected childhood and adulthood. It's another version of the glass tunnel that connects the children's library and the adult library in the book. Times have changed since I wrote that scene, and there's more sensitivity to those issues, which he seems to think is a good thing. And then Vulture reached out to him to comment on that quote when the movies came out in 2017. And he said, yeah, that sounds like my statement. That sounds like what I said. To it, I just add that it's fascinating to me that there's so much comment about a single sex scene and so little about multiple child murders. That must mean something, but I'm not sure what. And I was like, yeah, isn't that interesting? And I direct that isn't that interesting at my own reaction. Because yeah, child murder, sure. The first scene of the book is a baby having his arm ripped off. Georgie's 4 years old. And that, I'm like, what was he doing writing that scene? No, it never occurred to me. But the 12-year-olds having sex, I was like, oh my God, what is that? And so it's interesting when I see that, I'm like, oh, right. My impulses are deeply conservative in ways I have not acknowledged and can't head off at the pass sometimes. What I want to find and have not yet found is someone's dissertation about power, privilege, and difference in the works of Stephen King. Because there's so much in this book alone about how you might treat people who are different than you and some positive ways you might choose to interact with them instead of mean or bullying ways. That's really great. And then on the other side, it's like the Losers Club is the Losers Club because each of them has one location of oppression. It's just here are the cards, right? I'm going to deal this hand. Okay, you have a stutter and you have asthma and you're Jewish and you're black. And somehow having a stutter and being black are equated in a way that is what are you doing? So those two things are not the same, Stephen King. But in this book, they are presented as though they are just equal difficulties to have, which is highly questionable, of course, and incorrect, of course. There are some things he does well. Namely, it is the first time I was introduced to the idea that it's mean to bully people for being different. I mean, literally no one had told me that This book told me that. I was like, oh, I don't want to be that. Great. Also, being gay is a thing that happens, not a big deal. In the 80s in West Virginia, revelatory. Emily Rosenfield, who wrote for Medium.com, and I think this was in 2017 when the first new movie came out. She's talking about the movies in this article, but she makes this great point about how each of these characters has a thing that makes them a loser, right? Which is what I've just been talking about. Toward the end of the novel, even, as they're all forgetting these things that have happened to them, like it's just like their childhood is now legitimately just floating away and they can't remember things. They're like, oh, wait, did Eddie have asthma or was he prone to chronic migraines? I can't remember. Was Ben fat or did he have a club foot? I really can't remember. Rosenfield says that each of those little things is like just another dark secret for Pennywise to pick on. Like Ben's shame over being obese and Beverly's fear of her abusive father and Bill's guilt over his brother's death. It's all just like a thread to be tugged on. A board hung around the neck, headlined, "This is my trauma." She's like, it's cheap and it's ugly. And like at the same time that this book is teaching me, hey, maybe you don't have to bully people who are different from you. That's a very painful experience. Don't be that person. It's also sort of equating things that are absolutely not equated in the world. And on some level, Stephen King knows that because Mike, the one black character in this, well, he's not the one black character, but he's the character among the 7 main characters who is black. He is the only one who stayed in Derry. Everyone else left after age 12 or 13. He stayed, and he's the only one who has a marginal life. He like works in a library and he doesn't have a lot of money and he's basically poor. And everyone else is white and left and they're all rich. But he's the one, he called himself at the beginning of the book, he calls himself the lighthouse keeper. Like somebody had to stay so that we could all come back because we promised to come back if it started happening again, and I'm the one who had to stay. And I'm like, well, why are you the one that had to stay? Do we want to maybe explore that? Like, why the character with the most visible location of oppression is the one who ends up like living in this crap racist town for his entire life, waiting for a horrible thing to start happening again so he can call all his buddies back to fight it. I was like, whew, wow, that's crazy. I want to talk about the thing that has stayed relatively consistent with me in my readings of the book, which is how well he describes small town mentality and how even though it's a horror book, it's about a supernatural terror, so much about it is completely accurate and real. And you can actually sort of cut out the scary stuff and still have a really compelling book about what it's like to grow up in a small town. I said before, like this idea that adults just don't see half the shit that's happening around them because they're concerned with their adult things, and kids actually do see those things a little more clearly. That's part of it. Also, he's really good at writing the sort of generational thinking that happens in small towns. So if 2 people whose families have lived in a town for several generations are talking, it's not just those 2 people talking. It's their parents talking and their grandparents talking and their great-grandparents talking. And if you have a collection of people who are from families who have lived in an area for a long time, any gathering of people is actually 4, 5, 6 times greater than the number of people in the room. Because the night JFK was shot, I was with George's grandfather at this particular bar who's owned by this guy whose niece now teaches your sister Lucy's first grade class. It's like that kind of thing. And he does that really well. And he does it through the character of Mike, who is the one who stayed in town and became the sort of historian, right? Mike is the one who, I think, honestly, the character of Mike in this book is the person who hipped me to the fact that I would be very interested in historical fiction, because he combs newspaper archives and he interviews all the old timers he can find who've lived in Derry for so long, trying to get a sense of how long this thing has been here, right? And he's the one who discovers that there are photographs of it, lithographs of it, for at least 200 years. And he's like, oh my gosh, if it's been here for 200 years, how much longer might it have been here? Through Mike's historical investigation of this town, he's always talking about, this person's father is the one who found the first body and the second wave, whatever. And so these cycles are sort of built into it in a way that feels real for small town life when people stayed in place, and doesn't necessarily feel real for the way most people live now, where we travel and we move to a different place when we become adults,
Right. So he's holding the history.
And how history is like, you can't escape it if your family has been in a town for a long time, because you look at a person, but you see their whole family and everything their family has done. And they do the same to you.
So there's a social cycle just like there's a Pennywise cycle.
Yeah, generational. So I had forgotten or didn't know who William Carlos Williams was when I read the book the first time. And now I do, because I have a master's degree in poetry. And Williams is a modernist poet, American modernist poet, and he's beautiful. And his book, Paterson, is a book-length poem about Paterson, New Jersey, which is a small, formerly industrial town, a lot like Derry. He uses lines from that poem to set up so many of the early chapters. And so it makes a lot of sense that he would use lines from Paterson to sort of set up the opening chapters. I wouldn't call Williams high modernist, but he is a modern writer, capital M. He breaks things up. He shifts perspective. He includes snippets of conversations and all of those tricks that are now very, very everyday. This is just how we write. But at the time, it was a huge innovation in how we constructed narrative. So Stephen King is like the pop culture. And I don't say that dismissively. He's taken all those ideas and he's like, and here's how you can use it to tell a story about scary fucking clowns.
Right.
And have that book be super interesting and be a bestseller and be relevant 40 years later. Like, here's how you can do that to actually tell a story that resonates with people who don't give a shit about modernist poetry. Right? And so that's one of the reasons I like it now as an adult. I'm like, oh, look at the carnival you can create with these super sort of dusty modernist tricks. Like, oh, if I had known that you could make a circus is a little on the nose, right? But if I had known you could make a circus out of it, studying that poetry would have been different for me.
It lends Stephen King more weight. He does write pop culture books, but he's an incredibly good writer and dedicated writer. I had no idea that poem was a part of the structure or the inspiration for it, but there's a little bit of maybe him going, hey, by the way, I know this stuff.
Yeah, totally.
You think this is a dime store novel or whatever. It's not. Showing off just a little bit maybe, or even playing with literary history, even the recent history.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely reads to me like a flex, for sure. And I like it. I was like, right on, man, right on. So Bill Denbrough, the major, he's the lead. He becomes a writer in his later life. And there's a scene where he's in college and he's basically fighting with his writing teachers because he's writing horror stories. And they're like super into, no, you're not experimenting with form and all or whatever. And he has that fight in the book. And he's like, but can't it just be a story? Can't it just be a good story? Like, what? Why does it have to do all this other stuff?
What we're looking for is something that resonates with us on the level of being relatable. I don't know this. This is not researched. But I would imagine that it's almost impossible that Stephen King didn't write autobiographically when you mentioned that moment in college.
Oh, right.
I mean, who knows? But there had to be some inspiration from his childhood,
sure,
of course.
Sure.
In this story. So we look for something relatable. We look for something that resonates on that level of like, oh, I was a kid who wasn't monitored and I encountered some dark things, right? And I was scared. And I had a group of neighborhood friends. But then we also look for what resonates on a thematic level. And to me, that's where the good writing happens. And it doesn't matter what kind of literature it is. If the themes resonate, the themes resonate. And so you're obviously looking at themes of what it is to lose innocence, what it is to grow up, what it is to be an adult, and the adult's relationship to all the things that are happening in kids' world, and all the things that you forget as an adult, and all the magic you can no longer access as an adult.
I read into it. If you have an emotional reaction to it, if you want to keep turning the page, that's a good story. There are lots of things we can say to overlayer that initial assessment, right? But if you keep reading, that's a good story. And obviously we have, because it's 40 years later, right? It's really easy as an English major and person with an MFA to somehow think that being obscure is cool.
Right.
It's so tempting, right? And I am super guilty of it. No judgment for all of us struggling with that kind of elitism. I am here. There's a support group. It's going to meet online. I will tell you guys when, because I need it. But it's just so funny because I haven't gone back and read Paterson for 15 years, but I was like, I'm going to reread it right now. If the world falls apart and the things you choose are those kind of stories, then, maybe I can turn my analytical eye on myself and be like, oh, well, that is meaningful. They are meaningful. So it's not a hot take because it's a very old book, but that's my relationship with Stephen King's It. thank you for talking with me about it.
Thank you for talking to me about it. It makes me really want to read it again.
Well, I had to buy it, so I'll ship it out to you. It only weighs 8 pounds.
Everyone, thank you so much for listening to It Chooses You, and we will see you next time.
And thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
And bye.
Testing? Great. Thank you for listening to It Chooses You. Your hosts are Teresa Sparks and Claire Patton. Our theme song is by Bobby Dart. If you'd like to get in touch with us, drop us an email at itchoosesyouPodcast@gmail.com.